The smoke came from the Halverson place, 3/4 of a mile east. She could smell it before she saw it. That particular char of green things burning, wet stems and root matter that never wanted to catch, but caught anyway when a man ran out of other choices. She stood at the garden's edge in the gray before sunrise, bare feet in the dew-cold grass, and watched the thin column rise above the cottonwoods along Muddy Fork Creek. Not a cook fire. Too early. Too bitter. Too much of it. She did not move for a long moment. Behind her, the sweet corn stood in full tassel. The bean rows hung heavy, pods fattening on the vine. The squash had spread its broad leaves over half the south bed, and the turnips and onions were so far along she'd already pulled the first of them last week and laid them in the shade to cure. Every row intact, every stem upright, every root still gripping the earth the way roots were supposed to grip it. 300 yards east of her, past the fence line, past the dry ryegrass her husband had scythed down in July, the Halverson garden was gone. She knew it without walking over. She'd seen enough ruined ground in the last 2 weeks to know what burning it meant. The ducks were already working. She turned toward the pond. Their pond, 2 feet deep and 12 feet across, lined with creek clay that had dried to the color of old brick, and watched them move through the shallows at the irrigation inlet. 34 birds, most still as posts, bills pressed into the mud with a patience that had nothing to do with sight. They did not chase. They did not startle. They simply worked the bottom the way a good carpenter worked a board, methodically, thoroughly, without wasted motion. She watched a runner duck lift its bill, tilt its head, reset, and press down again 6 inches to the left. It had found something. The bill worked. The something was gone. She almost smiled. There were people in this county. People who'd stood in the spring market in May and laughed loud enough that she'd felt it between her shoulder blades. Who would not smile today? Who were burning what the snails had left them, or staring at rows of black-stemmed seedling stumps, or trying to reckon how far last winter's stored flour would carry them into the next one. And here she stood in front of a full garden, watching blind ducks clean the mud. It hadn't looked like this in May. In May, it had looked like 60 cents thrown into a creek, and a half-dug pond that made her husband's hands bleed, and a flock of birds that walked into fence posts and had to be steered toward their water dish with a willow switch. In May, it had looked like exactly what everyone said it was. She turned back to the smoke above the cottonwoods. It had not started here. It had started at the spring market, with a man and a cage, and 34 birds that nobody else would buy. The wagon had not made it 200 yards from the market square before the first man called out. She heard it from the seat, a carrying voice, the kind built for courthouse steps or camp revivals. Blind ducks, then laughter, the loose, unhurried kind that means the teller has an audience and intends to keep it. Her husband kept his eyes on the mule's ears. The reins didn't move. She watched the line of his jaw and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say, and they both knew it. The crate in the wagon bed held 34 birds. She had counted them herself at the third farmer's place, crouching in the mud of his yard, while he leaned on a fence post and watched with the patient resignation of a man disposing of a problem. The birds were mixed, mallards mostly, with a dozen runner ducks standing tall and narrow as fence pickets. All of them born wrong in the eye. Most could track light, vaguely, the way a man can tell noon from midnight through a closed lid. Beyond that, nothing. She had pressed her thumb gently to the bill of the nearest mallard. It flexed against her, sensitive, searching, exactly what she remembered. Her husband had found all three farmers through asking around quietly at the feed store, and between them had paid 60 cents for the lot. The first farmer had seemed almost grateful. The second had looked puzzled. The third had looked at her husband as though he suspected a joke. Now, a mile out of town, she turned on the seat and looked into the crate. A pair of runners stood pressed together in one corner, orienting toward the wheel noise. A mallard near the slat was moving its bill along the wood grain in slow, deliberate strokes. "They find by feel," she said, not to explain herself, just to say it aloud where it had air around it. Her husband glanced at her. She told him what she remembered from the delta. Her father's farm sat on land so low that water moved through it more than across it, and every spring the flooding brought snails up from the channel beds into the garden rows. Her mother's remedy had been purchased ducks, good-eyed ones, fast and ranging. But there had been a season when a fever moved through the flock and left them half blind, and her father had been ready to cull them, and her grandmother had said, "Wait, wait, and watch." And what they had watched, for 3 weeks that summer, was those compromised birds cleaning the mud better than the healthy ones ever had, because they moved slow and worked close and the bill tip never stopped. "They feel the vibration in the water," she said. "A snail moving through mud makes just enough. The bill finds it before the eye would." Her husband was quiet for a moment. The wagon creaked. The mule's tail swept once. "So they're better in the shallows," he said. "In shallow water and soft mud," she said. "They're the best tool there is." He nodded once, looked back at the road. She faced forward, too, the crate at her back. The laughter already a half-mile behind them and fading. He pulled the wagon off the road 3 days later with a plan already laid in his mind like a chalk line on a board. The pond would go here. He paced it out with his boot, counting strides. 10 feet from the first bean row, 12 across, no deeper than 2 feet at the center. Deep enough to hold water through July heat. Shallow enough for a blind duck to work the bottom without swimming blind in open water. The bill needed mud. The bill needed contact. He'd understood that much by the time the mule reached the yard. The wife had already cut stakes and stretched cord before he lifted a shovel. She moved the line twice, adjusting the angle so the pond's south lip sat directly beside the irrigation inlet, the narrow clay channel that drew from Muddy Fork Creek and fed the vegetable rows. She measured the drop with a stick in her eye. He watched her crouch and sight along the cord and felt the same thing he always felt when she worked a problem. The particular satisfaction of watching someone who actually knows what they're doing. The digging took 4 days. The soil came up heavy, full of clay already, which was good news. He filled the wheelbarrow to the edge and ran load after load down to the creek bank, where the clay sat dark and dense in the cut bank below the water line. The wife worked behind him, tamping the pond walls with a flat-faced mallet he'd built for fence posts, pressing the clay smooth in overlapping layers so there were no seams for water to thread through and disappear. It was hot work. June in Custer County was not kind about heat. He came in at midday with his shirt wrung and his shoulders aching and ate whatever she put in front of him and went back out. She worked the channel in the afternoons while the shade came off the cottonwood to the west. shaping the inlet mouth so the water entered slow. A thin, steady refresh that would keep the pond from going stagnant without flooding the vegetable rows. He hauled clay for 2 weeks, 14 loads. He kept count in the small notebook he'd carried since his carpentry days, the one he used for dimensions and timber tallies. 14 loads, 4 wheelbarrow legs replaced with a length of oak dowel when the original split. 2 evenings spent regrading the channel slope when the water wanted to pool short of the inlet. The ducks helped, in their way. They had been penned near the barn through the digging, and on the day he flooded the pond for the first time, pulling the creek gate stone and letting the water rise slow and brown and cold, he brought them over one by one in a crate and set them in. They took to it inside of a minute, bills in the water, moving slow across the bottom, working the mud at the edges where the clay was softest. The wife stood beside him at the pond's edge. Neither of them spoke. The work was there in front of them, holding water. That was enough. She started keeping her own notebook that June. Not his. He had the carpenter's ledger, with its columns of loads and dimensions and dowel diameters. Hers was a different instrument, a narrow flour sack cover she had stitched into a sleeve and filled with folded pages cut from a seed catalog they'd finished with. She wrote small to save space, date at the top of each entry, then what she saw, June 4th, 6 birds working the east shelf. Bills moving in arcs, not stabs, pulling bottom, not surface. She had watched waterfowl since she was old enough to follow her father along the delta channels in Louisiana, and she knew what healthy foraging looked like. These birds were not pecking blindly. They were reading the mud the way a carpenter reads a grain line with his thumb. Pressure, response, direction, decision. The bill tip of a duck carries more nerve endings than most people would credit. She had known this as a child without having words for it. Now she watched it working, here, in the clay pond her husband had hauled into existence by the barrow load, and she wrote down what came up. June 7th. Confirmed snail eggs, small clusters, pale, no shell yet. 3 birds pulling them consistently from the shelf edge. She crouched at the pond's rim in the early morning, when the light was low and flat, and let her eyes follow the ripple lines. The ducks moved without urgency. They did not startle, did not chase. They simply worked. A slow, systematic sweep that covered the bottom, the way a man trowels plaster, overlapping each pass, missing nothing. She began to notice the rhythm of it, the way 2 birds would work toward each other from opposite ends of a shelf, turning over the same strip of mud from both directions. June 11th. Beetle larvae, pale grubs, at least 30 pulled from the northeast edge. Also rootworm casings, empty but recent. It was the rootworm casings that made her stop and look up at the vegetable rows. The beans were 6 inches up. The corn was knee-high and climbing. She walked the first row slowly, crouching at intervals, pressing a finger into the soil beside a stem and feeling for the soft give that meant tunneling below. There was none. She moved to the 2nd row, the 3rd. She went all the way to the squash mound at the far end and knelt in the turned dirt and dug her fingers down 2 inches beside a young vine. Clean. She sat back on her heels and looked at the pond, then at the rows, then at the pond again. Her husband was mending fence on the far side of the claim and would not be back until noon. She wrote the entry without him. June 11th continued. Garden soil, rows 1 through 7, clear of larvae and egg clusters. compared to the Halverson plot I saw at the mill last week. Their bean rows already showing leaf curl at base, which means root damage already working. Ours are not. She underlined that last word once, then added a second line beneath it. The entry was dated August 22nd, written in the same steady hand, but the pressure of the pen was different. Harder, faster, the letters leaning forward as if the words were trying to outrun something. Muddy fork running thick. Haskell came to the fence this morning. She had been at the irrigation inlet when she heard the horse. Not a visiting pace, something quicker, a man riding with purpose across the flat. She stood up from where she was clearing reed stems and shaded her eyes. The rider was Emil Haskell from the southeast quarter, 2 claims over. He pulled up at the fence line and did not dismount, just leaned from the saddle with his hat already off, which told her everything before he spoke. Mrs. He stopped, started again. The creek's gone wrong. She walked to the fence. He looked rough, jaw unshaved, shirt damp from riding. His hat turned slowly in both hands. Snails, he said, coming up through the irrigation channels. Lund lost his entire bean row last night. Thought it was rabbits at first. Then Lund's wife went out this morning and the soil was moving. He shook his head. Moving. Just under the surface. Whole strings of them eating the roots from underneath. By the time they see the stem go limp, he spread one hand flat and tipped it sideways. Gone. She kept her face still. Who else? Corrigan and the Myers place north of the creek bend. 3 homesteads in one night. He rubbed a hand over his mouth. Could be more by now. I'm writing the claims to warn people for all the good that does. She said, "Thank you, Emil." He nodded, and his eyes moved past her. Past her to the vegetable rows behind the cabin, and then to the pond. She watched the moment register on his face, the corn standing clean and green and tall, the bean rows solid, the squash sprawling wide and undamaged across the far mound, and the ducks, a dozen of them, were working the inlet right then, bills in the shallows, that steady, methodical, sweeping motion, quiet as a clock ticking. He looked at the rows for a long time. He had been one of the loudest voices at the spring market. She remembered the exact pitch of it, not cruel, just certain, the way a man sounds when he believes he is saving someone from a mistake. Blind ducks, ma'am. You'd be better off with a cat. Now he sat on his horse at her fence with his hat in his hands, and he looked at her garden the way a man looks at a sum he cannot make add up. They're working, he said. Not a question. They've been working since May, she said. He looked at the pond again. The ducks did not look up. They never did. She heard her husband's hammer stop on the far side of the claim. The silence after it was complete, just wind across the corn. She had 2 rows of entries in the journal that described exactly what was happening in that garden, and why, and when it had started. She had been waiting for this conversation since June. She did not answer him right away. Instead, she opened the journal to the July entry, the 3rd, a Tuesday, and read it to herself first, the way she always did before she spoke about something that mattered. First light, silver trails at the inlet, 3 distinct lines running from the channel lip toward the bean row, shells the size of a thumbnail, buried just below the mud crust. They move slow, but they move. That morning felt like a different season now, the way a near miss always does in memory. closer and sharper than the ordinary days surrounding it. She had come out barefoot in the gray hour before the sun cleared the cottonwoods, the dew soaking through her hem before she had taken 10 steps. She checked the inlet every morning by habit, not by dread. But that morning the mud told her something different. The trails were faint. A child might have missed them. She had grown up watching her father read River Delta mud for exactly this kind of writing. The slow, pressed signature of something working underground, and her eyes found the pattern before her mind named it. 3 lines, then 5. Then, when she crouched lower, a dozen more threading out from the channel lip like cracks in old porcelain. She did not go back to the cabin. She went directly to the pond. All 34 ducks were roosting at the far bank, tucked into the reed fringe, still and content. She moved them the same way she always did. No shouting, no rushing. A low sound in her throat, a slow walk along the bank, pressing them gently toward the inlet end. They complained briefly, a low muttering, then settled. Their bills went down within 30 seconds of hitting new water. That was the thing about them that still struck her, even after 2 months. The speed of it. No hesitation, no confusion. The water was shallower at the inlet end and the mud softer, and they simply began. Bills sweeping in that slow, sure arc, the sensitive tip reading the mud like a finger across a page. By mid-morning, she had counted 2 full rows cleared, not cleared of visible snails, cleared of the entire advance, shells and eggs both, extracted from the first inch of mud with a precision that no hand tool she owned could have matched. The ducks did not eat every one on the surface and leave the rest. They found the buried ones, the eggs, the clusters pressed into the channel walls. They found things she could not see. She had knelt at the edge and pressed her own fingers into the mud after them, checking. The soil was disturbed in a fine crosshatch pattern. Every inch of it worked. She could feel where the shells had been. Small pressed pockets, now empty. By noon, she had written 3 pages. By evening, she knew the rows were safe. She did not know yet how bad it was at the other claims. She did not know yet that the same silver trails were writing themselves into 6 other gardens along Muddy Fork Creek, and that no one there had seen them yet. The first neighbor came at dawn. He was a big man, Halverson, with hands like spades and a face that had been sunburned and re-sunburned until it had taken on the color and texture of old saddle, leather. He had laughed the loudest at the spring market. She had watched him do it from across the stalls. That wide, open laugh. The elbow nudged into the man beside him, the chin tilted toward the pen of blind ducks her husband was loading into the wagon. She had filed it away without bitterness, just a fact, the kind you keep. He was not laughing now. He stood at the edge of their yard with his hat in both hands and said the creek had come through his rows overnight. Said it like a confession. Said his wife's bean plants were down to the stem, the lower third of them gone as if the soil had simply swallowed the roots back. Her husband listened, said nothing until Halverson finished. Then he picked up his hat from the peg beside the door, told her he would be back before midday, and walked out. They went together down the creek path, and she watched from the garden as the 2 men grew smaller and then disappeared between the cottonwoods. He had never walked another man's rows with the intent to calculate rather than console. It required a different kind of attention. He moved slowly, crouching every few feet, pressing his thumb into the soil beside each stem, the way he had watched her do beside the irrigation channel. Strip the sentiment away. Look at what is actually here. Halverson's bean rows. Total loss in the lower third. The upper rows had not yet collapsed, but the silver trails ran between them in long, looping arcs. Scouts, he understood now, not stragglers. The turnips, the same. The onion bed, worse because the bulbs themselves were the target, soft and just below the surface. And whatever hadn't been eaten had been circled by tracks so dense the soil looked like hammered tin. He walked all 6 plots before noon. Dahlberg's claim west of the creek, the Ostergaard widow's half-acre garden, which was the most meticulously kept ground he had seen outside of his wife's rows, and which was now 3/4 gone. 2 more claims down the South Fork, both reporting the same sequence. The invisible advance, the collapsed stems discovered at morning light, the silver trails appearing only when the sun hit low. He made his calculations out loud because Halverson had kept pace with him the whole time, and because saying a number aloud forced him to mean it. 34 ducks, 6 plots. The ducks worked approximately 120 square feet of mud per half-day at full efficiency. He had measured his wife's notes against the actual rows cleared. 3 days, he said, standing at the edge of the last ruined garden. Maybe 4 if the channel beds are as thick as yours. Halverson looked at the ducks' pond, still visible from where they stood, small and unremarkable in the flat distance. "And you'd do it?" he said. He would answer that question in a moment. But first, the middle of July, when the answer had not yet been required of anyone. She had started the tally stick the first morning after they spotted the initial trails. A length of cottonwood dowel she kept sharpened at one end and notched at the other, 1 mark per row inspected, a second cross-notch if the row came back clean on the evening check. It was the kind of record-keeping her father had used on the Delta for tracking flood lines, and she had adapted it without ceremony, the way she adapted most things that worked. The system was this. Mornings, she walked the ducks along the western perimeter, the side closest to the irrigation inlet, where the channel water came in cold and shallow off Muddy Fork Creek. The ducks moved slowly and with great purpose, their bills working the wet soil in the particular sweeping motion she had learned to read as productive. When a duck's bill came up empty 3 passes in a row, she moved it forward. When it stayed anchored, head lowered, she let it work. She had 34 birds, and she rotated them in groups of 8, giving each group 2 hours on the inlet side before cycling them back to the pond to rest and wade. Afternoons, her husband took the second shift, driving the remaining groups along the eastern rows, where the squash vines ran long and the beans had set their first pods. He was less practiced at reading the birds than she was, and he knew it, so he watched for her signals. She had told him that a duck working well leans slightly into the direction of the scent, that a duck about to quit lifts its bill and turns its neck, and he followed those cues with the careful attention he brought to a difficult joint in hardwood. The snails were there, invisible by daylight, present in the mud in numbers that the tally stick could not capture. But the ducks found them the way they found everything, not by sight, not by searching, but by being exactly the right instrument for the medium they moved through. Bill tip to soil, vibration, resistance. The small mechanical fact of a body coiled in the dark, giving itself away to a thing that had never needed eyes to know. On the 3rd day, she noticed the silver trails had not advanced past the second squash row. On the seventh day, the trails were shorter, less numerous, as if whatever was crossing the inlet mud had begun to turn back. On the 10th day, she walked the entire perimeter with her lantern held 6 inches from the ground, moving slowly, checking every notched row in sequence while the full dark settled around her, and the ducks slept in the pond in a loose cluster, heads tucked. The light found nothing new, not a trail, not a collapsed stem, not a single track in the wet clay that had not been there and accounted for. She put a final clean notch on the tally stick and stood up straight. The word reached the first neighbor before she even came in from the garden. He had gone to the Adler place at first light, not to boast, not to explain, but because he had seen the man standing at the edge of his bean rows the evening before, with the particular stillness of someone who has stopped calculating and started grieving. He brought the ducks in the wheelbarrow, bedded in a layer of damp creek clay to keep their feet right. All 34 packed in close and quiet the way they settled when moving had become familiar. The Adler rows were worse than he'd expected. The soil between the bean stems had gone pale and slick where the snails had worked it. The roots clipped underground so cleanly the plants still stood upright for a day before they fell. He set the low board barriers he'd built, 8 inches of pine scrap, nailed into rough rectangles that could be shifted plot to plot, and opened the wheelbarrow. The ducks went to work. It was not dramatic. It was never dramatic. They fanned out across the damaged rows in the same unhurried, bill-down manner they used beside the squash, reading the soil the way he read a plank for true, not looking for error so much as letting the instrument report it. She worked the far end of the rows, moving the board barriers forward as each section cleared, keeping the birds concentrated, keeping them from wandering into the unplanted ground where there was nothing to find. By afternoon, they had done the Adler plot and moved to the Hennessy claim next east. The second day was harder. The soil on the Hennessy ground was heavier, more clay-bound, and the ducks tired faster in the resistance of it. She soaked the inlet edge with 2 buckets of creek water to loosen the top inch, and watched the birds recover their rhythm within a quarter hour. He said nothing when she did it. He had long since stopped being surprised by what she knew. On the third day, they worked 2 plots before noon and 2 after, and by the time the light dropped low and copper behind the ridge, all 6 neighboring plots had been covered. The neighbors came that evening without being summoned. They came the way people come when obligation and shame are pulling in the same direction, quietly, with their hats in their hands and something prepared to say that they then didn't say. The Adler man spoke first. He named what he had. Timber he'd milled in the spring, cut for a barn addition that hadn't happened yet. 2 other men had days to offer. A fourth had iron fittings. Someone had mortar lime, hauled from the Kearney Freight Road and sitting unused in a dry sack under his wagon. She stood beside her husband and listened to the tally of it build, piece by piece, into the exact shape of the thing they had not been able to finish alone. The root cellar. They broke ground on the cellar the next morning. 4 men with spades and a borrowed drag scoop opened the earth in the first 2 hours, while her husband set batter boards and ran his lines the way a carpenter does, not by feel, not by hope, but by measurement. She watched him crouch over the corner stakes and knew what it cost him to receive help without flinching. He was not a man who asked. He was learning, slowly, that not asking and not receiving were 2 different failures, and only one of them was his to carry. The timber went in on the second day. The Adler man knew how to square a sill, and he and her husband worked without needing to talk much, which suited them both. The iron fittings came next. Hinges, a hasp, a length of rod for the latch bar, and the mortar lime went into the joints while it was still workable and the air still dry enough to let it cure clean. She mixed the slurry herself, the way she had watched her father do along the Louisiana Delta, adding just enough water and no more, testing it against her palm. The door was hung on the third afternoon. Her husband drove the last spike, set the hammer down on the sill, and opened the door and closed it once. The hinges held. The frame didn't rack. He stood there a moment with his hand still on the latch and didn't turn around right away, and she understood that too. Some things need a breath of privacy, even when no one is looking. That evening they carried the first of the preserved goods down the steps themselves. The sealed crocks of dried beans, the tied bundles of onion, the squash set in straw rows along the lower shelf. Each thing placed deliberately, each thing proof. Later, when the light had gone soft and the air had cooled enough that the frogs along Muddy Fork had started their low current of sound, they walked to the pond. 2 ducks were working the shallows, not the full flock. The others had settled into the reeds at the far edge, but 2, moving with that same unhurried, unerring patience. Bills sweeping the silt in slow arcs, finding what the eye would never find. The water barely rippled where they moved. The garden rows stood dark and full behind them. She stood beside her husband and did not say anything, and he did not say anything, and this was not a silence that needed filling. The root cellar door was open behind them, and inside it were the fruits of a year's work stacked in the cool dark. Safe from frost, safe from rot, safe from everything that had tried to take it. The ducks kept working. The pond held its light a little longer than the sky. She found his hand, and he let her take it, and they stood there until the last of it faded.